Hoodoo plant mamas, get your soul fed and your spirit red.
This here ain't no trend. I possess the power from way back when folk was stripped from all of their kin, so they had to find the magic within. Ancestors together my herbs, I conjure at my altar. Voodoo plant mama, I manifest growth and I release trauma.
Child, we just out here trying to water our plants and mind our business, you know? Everybody ain't from the deep south, man. Everybody can't have culture like us.
Hey y'all, and welcome back to another episode of Hoodoo Plant Mamas. I am your co-host, Leah Nicole.
And I'm Dani P.
And today we are joined by the lovely Ashia. Ashia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi Danielle, hi Leah. My name is Ashia. I am an author, eco-griot. Yeah, just overall ecological baddie who loves talking about plants. And I'm really excited to be here with y'all today.
We're excited to have you today. Well, before we get into the episode, we could do a quick check-in and then get into some gratitude. Ashia, how are you feeling today?
You know, I am feeling too blessed to be stressed. I woke up early, like I felt good, very much like that Jill Scott song, and just, enjoying what is trying to be summer. I'm here in the Bay Area where everywhere else, it's like, I've heard it's humid. It's like really, really hot. I was actually in Virginia about like maybe a month, not even that long, maybe like 2.5 weeks ago or so. And that felt like summer. But here it's like 60 degrees and cloudy. In the Bay Area, we don't get summer until like maybe mid-August to like early October is weird over here. But I'm trying to embrace it. I think like after a few years of living here, I've gotten used to it. And I'm just like, yeah, trying to take it one day at a time, how it goes. And I'm feeling really grateful. How about y'all?
It's hot as hell in the South. If you go outside, you instantly start sweating. So I'm hearing 60 degrees, like, oh my God, that sounds like a dream. But today I am doing better. By the time this episode comes out, the pre-order for this book will be out. But like I've been working on my latest book. It's called Between Us. I'm super excited about it. Super excited for it to come out. And that's how I'm doing. How about you, Dani?
I've been having a little bit of back pain. I realize it may be just stress, which is a thing for me. But other than that, I'm doing okay. I'm in North Carolina. The weather has been weird the past couple of weeks where it's been a little rainy, not as hot, and then the evenings have been cool. I probably should be concerned because I was like, oh, I'm going to open my window and get this breeze because I'm like, why is it feeling breezy and like cool at night in the summer? But yeah, but it's definitely probably like a month or so ago, particularly in July, steaming hot. So tangent, but yeah, I'm doing good aside from the back pain. But we can let's get into some gratitude. Ashia, what are you thankful for today?
What most immediately comes to mind is fresh brewed coffee. I'm really grateful for that and the people who grow it and harvest it. I had the pleasure last year of going to Cuba, and I got some beans from this sweet auntie, and I've just been saving them. And I'm just really grateful for her doing her own regenerative ag thing and like being a model for us. I'm grateful for the city sweepers who make sure our streets stay nice and clean, and do like the downtown work, because here we have like a lot of issues with trash and people coming in actually from other cities to dump, which is messed up. And I'm grateful for the folk who do it through the city, and then also just like good people who are like, I'm not about it, and do the city cleanup and try to make Oakland a nice place for all of us to live. Yeah, those are two things I'm grateful for today. What about you, Leah?
I'm going to say I am grateful for artists. I have been working with one for my book covers, and he's like, I hate to give credit to a man, but he is so talented. I'm like, this is art. You are an artist. Like the way that he's able to think and be, I'm like, ugh, he just makes my job so much easier. So I'm like, thank God for artists. Thank God for people who like can think in that way and use creative. Oh, a gift. How about you, Dani?
I'm thankful for friendship. Yeah, it just being like a steady thing that's keeping me afloat, even when everything else is feeling chaotic and really bad, just friendship being like a lifeline. And Roxy, my child, my heart, the best thing that's ever happened to me. Roxy is my cat. I think most people know that, but I should probably say that because I think one time I casually said that and someone thought I had children. And I'm like, yeah, I do. They're not what you think, not the kind you think. But yeah, well, let's get into the episode. I really wanted to open up with a question of kind of about your journey into this work. Can you talk about a defining moment in your early life that led you into environmental justice work, not just as an educator, but also as a writer and a poet and an artist?
Absolutely. It's like kind of hard to pinpoint one because I feel like I have like a lot of like very small moments over the course of my life that have really influenced how I think about environment and how I think about environmental justice. But really, like a big one was sitting with my grandma in her garden. My grandma is originally from, well, she's originally from Bentonia, Mississippi. She hitchhiked with her husband to Detroit, Michigan during like the Great Migration and like lived most of her adult life in Detroit, Michigan, worked on the assembly lines at Ford, and then came out to Denver. I was born and raised in Denver, came out to Denver with my mom and like helped raise me. And my grandma always, like always miss Detroit, always like kind of like miss Mississippi, but she grew to enjoy Denver. And so one of the things that she had always carried with her was her garden. Whether she was in Bentonia, whether she was in Detroit, whether she was in Denver, she wanted to always have a garden. And I remember her telling me stories when I was younger and when I was little. It's like stuff that like you kind of like half listen to, like your elders like tell you when you're like really little and you just want to like go out and play. But it really does stick with you. You go because they repeat it so many times. So like like it really does stick with you. And I remember her just like telling me stories about like how everybody at that time in Detroit. Now this is like pre-Detroit riots of like 60s. So a lot of stuff changed after the riots, but pre the riots, like like when like a big influx of Black folks were moving to Detroit, pretty much everybody had a garden, whether it was like really big, whether it was like really small. Like if you had a house, even if you had like an apartment, sometimes in like the next vacant lot, like you would have a garden. And these would be like community owned ones. These would be just like individual owned gardens. And a lot of that was, I think, like some lingering need for food security during that migration, but also, like he who feeds you controls you. So a lot of people knew like we gotta grow our own food. We need to like supplement. We also like can't afford a lot of the, healthy produce and veggies. One of the things that my grandma told me was like, going to some stores in Detroit. And this was like, when people talk about like segregation, people think about it as like this very defined thing. But then there's also places where you are not welcome, even if it is not like, like explicitly stated that it is a segregated store. And so sometimes she would be going to like white grocery stores because the stores in the Black neighborhoods, they were specifically giving like produce that was wilting, that was rotting, that was not just like good quality, and they were putting those in the Black grocery stores. So she's telling me a lot of these stories, and like how she's in Denver, and like that memory is still carried with her. Like to have a garden. We're living in Denver in a place where there's still like definitely like segregation. This is like in the 2000s. It wouldn't be explicitly called that, but Denver is one of the most segregated cities in the United States. But yeah, a lot of people don't know that because people don't know that there's Black folks out in Denver. There are. We are small but mighty. But it is one of the most segregated places in the country. And I think that there's some of that lingering like desire for like sovereignty, for like agency, for like in case something happens, like I need to be able to have like my own like little garden. I need to be able to have my own food. And so just like being able to see her do that, and then also her connecting it to a lot of like once the riots happened and like military law was like implemented, and like a lot of people's properties were seized, or like a lot of white flight happened, a lot of those like garden beds, they just like went away. That's like one of the first things that happens. I feel like, like of course, like we focus a lot about on like the very human impact, like the neighborhoods that are changed. But one of the most powerful things that, like white supremacy and that what governments can do is that they can just seize land and they can completely change it. So they can uproot trees. They can like tell you, oh, you can't garden here. They can like designate vacant lots as like blighted and burdened. And even though the people have been dealing with it for years, and they've been working on their own ways of like remediating or taking care of it, and have been begging the city to do something about it. As soon as, you know, like the tensions boil up to a certain point where people have no choice but to like revolt and to act, you know, a certain way, then the city can come in and say, oh, well, we designate this neighborhood blighted, so we're going to condemn everything, and we're going to uproot the trees, and we're going to uproot the people. And so, you know, that was very formative. Even as a child living in like Denver, Colorado, sometimes, you know, there's certain things that you like can't really imagine happening, but then you hear about it. And then, of course, you know, like even given the times that we're living in right now, like where it's a very real possibility, and, you know, like it's a very real threat that a lot of governments are making, you just realize how much power a government has over land and has over what you can grow on that land. And so that was really what kind of, you know, piloted me into thinking really critically about issues of like land use. And then also, you know, like urban renewal in Denver, Colorado, like we had we had I think he was our second Black mayor. Everybody was really excited, and he was pushing really aggressively for urban renewal. This was a time where a lot of like marijuana legalization money was getting pumped into Denver, and they were pushing really hard for urban renewal. So they were cleaning up historically black neighborhoods and historically Latine neighborhoods, you know, redoing a lot of the housing, and then people couldn't afford to live there anymore. And so, you know, witnessing that, and then also hearing, you know, like my grandma's narratives, it felt very much that like time was very cyclical. And this kind of stuff happens in different forms. You know, like the technology they might be using is a little bit different because, you know, it evolves, but the tactics and like, you know, like the desires are very much the same. So, you know, hearing my grandma's narrative, and then also just like bearing witness to this really solidified, you know, how I was conceiving and thinking about like environmental justice.
So I'm glad that you brought up migration, because that was something that I felt was kind of a reoccurring theme in this collection in Heirloom. So for those who may not know, the Great Migration is where Black people left the South in droves for the first half of the 1900s. And in this collection, you wrote about your family coming from Mississippi, ending up in Colorado. You wrote in God Save the Forest, Mississippi is a graveyard of all my kin's wildest ambitions. And so there was a quote that we read in Black Earth Wisdom, which is our guiding text for this season, where we're talking about Black people and environmentalism, where Jermaine Jenkins of Fresh Future Farm said, land in the South feels like a giant altar charged with 1,000 ancestors. And I've really been sitting with that, especially in the context of this story and why Black folks leave, but also think, especially in terms of like spirituality, some of our roles is to tend to the dead and tend to the land. So like, what do we do with this graveyard that is the South? And so I'm interested in your thoughts about migration and Mississippi and spirituality.
Wow. Oh my gosh. What a poignant question. And then I was like, Black Earth Wisdom, that sounds familiar. Yeah. Leah Penniman, who was very much influential, you know, in a lot of my thinking. What was it called? Is a guide that she wrote. I'm so bad with titles sometimes.
Farming While Black.
Farming While Black. Yeah, I mean, I think like for me, especially, I feel some of that being in Oakland in a lot of ways. There's a lot of heaviness, and there is a very like it's kind of like all encompassing the graveyard, not only just of like Black folks in the city, in the urban center, but also, you know, like of indigenous folks, you know, the indigenous folks that were like genocided and murdered and like and removed, and then also just like relocated. I think that, you know, like one of the things that I'm writing about when I talk about migration, someone was telling me that actually like it might be more accurate to call it like a great cleansing, or like a great like purging, instead of the Great Migration, because a lot of people were not leaving willingly. Like a lot of folks wanted to stay with family. They wanted to stay, you know, like where they were loved. But white vigilantism and the government made it so toxic and so dangerous for Black folks to remain that they had no choice but to leave. I highly think that if like Mississippi was a place where my family could thrive, like we probably would have stayed, because of just like how Black Mississippi is, how beautiful it is, how much memory there is there, how much of our just like ancestors' bones are there, you know, that like that's where like my people come from. And I think that that is very much evident not only like in my writing, but even in the way that I was raised. Like some people like tell me, especially it's funny because, you know, being in the West, some people tell me like, oh, like you like say certain words like, you know, like with a little twang or something, or like you have like a certain way you speak. And I'm like, yeah, it's because my grandma's like, you know, like from Mississippi, and like she taught me like in a lot of ways how to read and to talk and to be myself. Some of my like mannerisms, you know, like I think that is one of the ways that we like carry on our dead, even if we are, you know, like away from them. even like on my altar, I make sure that I have like certain plants or like certain herbs that like were like really important to my family, like in Mississippi. So even though I'm away, I'm still carrying on that memory. And one of my friends says like, everywhere in the US is like an extension of the South, even if folks don't want to admit it, or even if folks don't want to like claim it. I see that so much. Like when I go to like Richmond, when I go to Oakland, like a lot of folks like during the second Great Migration during like World War II, they were coming out to like Oakland and Richmond. And even some of the practices like, like sweeping like the doorstep, like, the blue bottles, like a lot of people like do that stuff out here, so we carry on that cultural memory and we carry on that, like that spirituality and those spiritual practices. But, as I think about climate change too, and like, like flooding and like occur, like, like really real threats that are happening in Mississippi, in like, like the Gulf South, that's something that's also on my mind when I'm thinking about, like the actual physical land and like what memories are like it saturated in the soil. We might be losing like a lot of that, and how do we like maintain that? And that's, kind of keeping up with practices. I think that like archive is super important. I think like venerating our dead is super important, keeping that storytelling aspect alive, whether that is like on the written word or whether that is, like via oral history, making sure like folks know, having like, like images, having like those like certain practices is super important. And I think it's up to us, like as future ancestors, to make sure that that kind of like memory is maintained. This is like a hard question for me, because I think about things in terms of like how much we've lost, and it makes me so sad. And it just like, the grief that you like have to sit with is so profound that it's just like it's hard to like kind of untangle all of the various ways that we have to heal and we have to respond to it. But I do think that like, like acknowledging it is one of those really important ways. And even the line that I wrote, like Mississippi is a graveyard of all my kin's wildest ambitions. Like I think that is very much in direct relation to like we buried a lot of stuff back there, like whether it was like physical stuff, whether it was like umbilical cords, whether that it was like shoes, whether was like herbs, whether it was like seeds, like a lot of the stuff that we buried, it was like a time capsule, because we knew that that was like land that held us and will like like continue to hold us both like spiritually and like ecologically, even if we aren't physically there.
I love the statement about it being like a purge, because one of the things my grandma told me about leaving. Now, mind you, she her oldest sister had already left and went to Chicago. Their oldest brother, who was a veteran, he had been up there for a while, and he was probably a part. He's much older than them, so he's probably a part of that first wave going north. But she said that the only jobs for Black women were like cleaning houses or being a teacher, because she got a degree. But even with a business degree, she could only be a teacher. And she really always had this dream of being like in the corporate world as a little girl. I don't remember where that came from, but I think she just always wanted to be like a businesswoman or something like that. And so that was part of the reason she left. But I agree. I think, and she's back. Like she eventually moved back to Mississippi. That's part of the reason why I grew up most of my life in Mississippi from 8 until I recently came to North Carolina a couple of years ago. So yeah, I really like that framing, because I feel like a lot of people, I don't know, it's talked about in interesting ways, but thinking about it as in people didn't necessarily want to leave their family and their people is a really good way to think about it.
So something else that I loved about this collection is how you were able to tie Black folks' oppression to the destruction of trees and pollution of the ocean. And so in Southern Symphony and Four Movements, you wrote, "The wood that raised the church, shorn skin of cistern axe felled, a sort of revenge for its complicity in the black curtain it made our ancestors." And it reminded me of how I've often tried and failed to articulate this trauma with Black people and the trees in the South, because trees hold memory. And what does it mean to be around the same trees that were the site of horror, the site of terror for our ancestors? And in addition to that, the fear that a lot of Black Southerners have of the forest while being surrounded by it. I know part of it is like blood memory, and then I also know that trees are our ancestors as well. And so I felt the same way reading Durag, where you wrote, The Atlantic remembers every part of Black anatomy, and it was referencing our ancestors who either jumped or were thrown during the transatlantic slave trade. So all of our pain and our trauma between the elements and nature and Black folks is interconnected. So I was wondering if you could speak more on that.
Absolutely. This is like, like if there is ever an argument in my work, this is kind of like the central one, is like navigating that tension, because that tension is really real. I think especially as someone who like used to or like continues in some ways to work with young people, even some of the comments that they say. So I used to be a garden educator, and like when I would work with like some of my Black youth, like especially like some of the Black male youth, they'd be like, I don't want to be doing this. Like my ancestors already did all this. Like I don't want to be doing this. Or like, like, and sometimes they'd be making like slick comments. Like it was like half joking, but it's also like, okay, so you're saying that, but you're saying that for a reason. Either you like heard it from somebody, or like you are very much aware of this, like, ancestral like memory, or you feel it in your body. I think like sometimes we don't trust like young people to like really like feel things in their body, and like, and sometimes we just like take like what they're saying, like, oh, they're just like saying that to say that, but like, like that is coming from somewhere, right? But in navigating this, I think that my eyes were like really opened by, I read this a few years ago, but it is a book by Kimberly Ruffin, called Black on Earth, African American Literary Traditions. And she's specifically thinking about like African American eco-literary traditions. So she's evoking like a lot of folks like, like Harriet Tubman and like George Washington Carver. And then like, I don't know if y'all are familiar with like Frank X. Walker, who's like one of the Afrolation poet. Like, so like she's talking a little bit about his work and other folks' work. And in the introduction, she posits this concept called the ecological beauty burden paradox. And that is what is like central to how Black folks understand, engage with, and think about nature. So when you're white and you're out on a hike, you're just enjoying your hike. You're not worried about anybody asking why you're there. You're not worried about anybody potentially physically harming you. Or, maybe if you're a woman, that's a little bit different, right? But you are not like, you do not have all of these things going through your head. Whereas like Black folks, we go on a hike, or we go out to even like something like we go out to a picnic in a park, enjoying this, what is usually like a man-made urban nature space, which is totally fine. Sometimes we need, like a lot of the environments that we understand today have been like stewarded for generations. They are not like devoid of like human influence, but you are in this like designated zone for outdoor recreation. You're lighting your grill, and then, oh, I was like, why does it sound familiar? Oh, like Barbecue Becky. This lady, white lady, comes up to you, says, oh, what are you doing here? You need to have a permit. Like, you can't even enjoy looking at a tree because somebody's always all up in your business, and somebody's always breathing down your neck and telling you what you can and cannot do. So that concept was really like helpful for me, in thinking about extending that. And like, and she's not just talking about it in like that kind of setting, but she's talking about it even if you go to the beach, if you go, like, you are looking similar, like what I said, like in Do-Rag, you are looking at the Atlantic, and it elicits a response that like a lot of white folks or non-Black people might not have. I would like, maybe even put this akin to some of the feelings that you have when even when you're driving on long stretches of highway, like, there's like a very strong sense of just like, even if you aren't, sometimes it's like you feel like you're being watched, or you feel like so much spiritual energy in an area. So it's like that kind of like, that, yes, there is that very like real material fear of like being visibly Black while outside, which, oh my gosh. And then there also is that very spiritual aspect where you recognize, like, you can feel that pain. I remember like one time when I was in college, I went to college in Connecticut, and we did like a little girls trip down to Rhode Island. And I'm like sitting there, and I'm like staring at the ocean, and like my friends are like having like a good time and like playing. And I'm just like, I'm feeling everything. Like, I'm just like feeling so much, and I don't know how to articulate it. And that's like very, like that's very real, because like I'm looking at this beautiful expanse of water, and I'm also like, like thinking about everything that transpired over it. And even if I would say like, like some Black folks who might not, like, I study this, right? Like, and I study history, and I'm very intimate, like with like ecological history and environmental history. But even some folks who might not be as like familiar or whatever with the history, I think you still feel it. And then you're like, why do I like feel like weird, or like, why do I feel like really like strongly about this? Like, because like your body remembers, like, like your body is your mother's body, is her mother's body, is her mother's body. And like all of that is like really important memory. But then, I think about times that I've been in like Senegal, and like I've just seen like Black folks like swimming in the ocean and like fishing and like having a great time. And that is so beautiful to me. That's like so healing to me, like to like see folks who are like expert swimmers, who are just like kind of doing their thing, who are out in like itty bitty rickety boats, like pulling up like big nets of fish like it's nothing. And I think like Blackness is so expansive and it's so complex, but it is, like very much informed by our environments and our relationship to like, like to land and into the things that are in that area. One other thing that I'll say too, is like, especially with like the history in the South of lynching, and that's not something that's just like concentrated to the South. It's very sad. There was a man who was found hanging. I'm sorry, this might be a little triggering, but there was a man who was found hanging by a rope in Bayview Hunters Point in California, in San Francisco, and they are saying that it is alleged suicide. But like Black folks, and we know what it is, right? Like, so like you think that these are things that are concentrated to a certain area, and they're really not. Like it's very much, again, an extension of a whole system that demonizes, hates, really like extracts like Blackness. But oh my gosh, thinking about that made me like lose my train of thought, because that was scary.
You had prompted a thought for me about my trip to Senegal and being at the door of no return, and talking about sort of that spiritual kind of complicated experience of what our body remembers when engaging with certain parts of the natural world. It had prompted for me the memory of looking out of the door of no return, and like, yeah, I can't even really describe it, because I felt a emptiness, especially after, our tour guide had just finished telling us the meaning behind it. I don't know, I didn't have a good feeling, but I didn't have a bad feeling. It just felt really empty. I just felt really empty. But on the other hand, because this is all on Ghrey, is it Ghrey Island? Aside, in this same ocean that you're looking at out of the door no return, just like you mentioned, there's like kids and families, most of them Black, just in the ocean having a good time. And it was just jarring. Like, it was jarring because you have those emotions, but then you see these people just being free in the ocean. Even for me, as someone who loves trees, I love being able to see trees outside of my window. I've always had a thing for trees, even as a child. I also frequently think about what stories a tree is holding, and what violent stories they're probably holding from, it's particularly in Mississippi, from like everything they witnessed. Because for whatever reason, there was this obsession with discarding us, not just in trees, but in bodies of water. So, and I'm sure someone very smart has written about this, but it's something I think about, like, that just this whole thing of leaving us, discarding us in the earth in that particular way as an act of violence.
Yeah, I just wanted to name that, even being on like Ghrey, like the past, the present, and the future, it collides so like strongly there. And like I also just want to empathize. Like I also felt like a very sense of like an emptiness, like something in like basically somebody had like unplugged the drain almost, like on me, because in a lot of ways, at least like, like the way that I think through it is that the door of no return was like where we became detribalized Africans. We were no longer, like Igbo. We were no longer, like Congolese. We were no longer from Benin. We were just Black. And there, and like now I love that. I love being Black, and we form ourselves into a community, but we lost a lot of our ancestral traditions, either by, like that being physically like extracted from us, it being beaten out of us. And we lost a lot of our language. We carried a lot of stuff, but we lost a lot, and, and took on this new identity, and then got transplanted to this like new world that was very different, but also strangely familiar. Whether that was in like the Caribbean or South America, or even in the American South, like one of the reasons why they picked the people, or like, like why slaveholders picked the people that they picked, was because they knew of farming skills, and they knew of like metalworking skills, and they knew that these were like folks, and indigenous folks who were really good at that. And so, we made and shaped, in a lot of ways, we shaped the South into something that it needed to be for us, to the degree that we could. And I think that, there was still that lingering just like anger around that. Like our bodies and minds and spirits were supposed to be broken entirely, And still like a piece of that lingered and a piece of that remained, and you see it like etched into the landscape, and it still remains.
Let's get into some ways you can support the Hoodoo Plant Mamas. One is through our bookshop, where you can buy the books that we've discussed with our Writing the Spirit guests. We have a Hoodoo Beginner's Guide, Tarot and Oracle decks, as well as our top reading picks. You can also buy Leah's books. Every purchase you make helps support our show. Check us out at bookshop.org/shop/Hoodoo Plant Mamas, or click the link in our show notes.
Our Patreon is currently paused, but other ways you can support us include rating and reviewing this podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Follow us on Instagram at Hoodoo Plant Mamas. You can donate via Cash App, # Hoodoo Plant Mamas, or our PayPal, hoodooplantmamas@gmail.com. Let's get back to the show.
When you were talking earlier, you were talking about being a garden educator and working with youth, and it reminded me of a discussion you and I had, Leah, actually, while we were reading the book, about this sort of feeling of associating labor outside, even in gardens, with like slavery. How making those little jokes, because you mentioned, Leah, you and your siblings made similar jokes when your dad would make y'all work outside, because of, what you hear from family and what you learned. In thinking about children, there was two lines that really just like stayed with me throughout reading this book. Was from No Neutral Zones. The two lines are: at the playground, pretend is power. Children build brave new worlds from dirt and earth. These two lines really, and the entire poem, brought up many things for me. But one is like Black folks, and especially Black children, and how we're stripped of the freedom of imagination, how powerful imagination is when thinking about liberation. And children in particularly, like, we've been children before. And if you were children like before the internet, or at least before it was readily accessible and you didn't have to like tie up the phone lines, your imagination was all you had. Outside in Mississippi, like, our imagination was all we had out during the summers. We didn't, we might have had a little small play set, but we didn't have anything elaborate to like play with. And so we would just create these worlds and create these games and just, I don't know, just build something out of what felt like nothing. The point I'm trying to get at is that we have our imaginations until somebody tells us, like, we don't. Like, we strategically get pushed out of spaces, we get pushed out of stories that convince us that there's limits to our imaginings and there's limits to where we can go in the world. And it brings me back to children always, because there's a lot of complicated like conversations around children. On one hand, people demonizing young people because, like, oh, they're too reliant on technology and social media. This is what they were given. But also just like the sort of dismissing or underestimating how much we need them, how much we need their imagination, and how we don't have to be those forces that are limiting them. And I'm thinking about how dangerous this is when it comes to environmental justice, because I think, like, it's all, it's all in conversation. I don't think you can talk about environmental justice, obviously, without talking about children and the rights of children and the voices of children. I'd love to know your perspective on what is the role of children in environmental justice movements, not just in the US, but also just worldwide.
Woof. Oh my gosh. I think about this a lot, and it's reminding me of, and I'm going to butcher this quote real bad, but it's reminding me of something that I read, and I don't know if y'all are familiar with, by Ritual, by Malidoma Patrice Somé, who is a Nigerian author, and was talking a lot about ritual, and it was really, informative for me. And he was saying something like, when the elders of like the village are not held in high regard, the adults cannot do what they like need to do, and then the children are left confused. And I think that we are really seeing some very serious manifestations of that today. When I think about, like even what you're mentioning, the over reliance on cell phones, when we're thinking about like the immediate move to give like a child a tablet, or the immediate move to like have them in the house. I think that there's a couple things that come to mind. One, I think that is a manifestation of fear. I think that a lot of Black children do not live in very safe environments, and they do not live in areas where they can readily play outdoors. I also do think that the outdoors have been systemically stripped from them. Like, you looked at that in land use policy. Like, if you can't, like, you can't walk anywhere. Like, if you're not in a neighborhood where there's like, it's very like easily accessible or walkable. A lot of times the sidewalks aren't maintained, lawns are overgrown. Like, that's like a very purposeful systemic choice. So you'd rather be inside where there's an entire world already built for you. And don't get me wrong, I wasn't really a video game kid, but I was an online game kid. Like, I loved online games, but I also like balanced it out, right? You know, like with outdoors, because I had access to that. Like, I could go outside and I could use my imagination. I also had really strict parents who were like, okay, you have 30 minutes on your game and then you're going to play outside. And then, you know, a lot of parents are overworked. They simply just do not have the time. They don't have the time to read to young folks, to their kids. They don't have time to like take them to the park, which, you know, and again, we're losing in a lot of ways. We're losing that communal aspect of things. Because like, again, so much falls on individual parental units. And a lot of times a lot falls on single moms to basically be everything and anything for their kids, which is just unfair to them and to also to their kids. So that's happening. And then I also think that, you know, think about, and this is no shade to nobody in particular, but thinking about the quote that Somé, and, you know, this has been ringing around in my head that I had offered from Somé. A lot of young people, they just don't have mentors now to look up to. Like, who are the adults that they are looking up to? Who is like, you know, like giving them strength, and who is giving them empowerment, and who is setting an example for what they should be or what they can be. Not even should, because like, I'm not trying to tell like any young person what to do, because sometimes, you know, I go into classrooms and like young people will make like such an astute or like an incisive like observation. It's like, dang, I didn't even think about it like that. And that's, you know, like, I think the magic of like youth and of childhood is having that unrestricted imagination. So even when I'm doing like intergenerational stuff, like sometimes we'll do like freedom dreaming, and even like some of the older employees that I work with, I'm like saying like, okay, imagine like what things look like in 5 years. And theirs is like extremely structured. It's like, okay, well, we need to like do this, and then we need to like do this recruitment, and then we need to do XYZ. And then young people are like, well, we have a garden and we have chickens, and there's like a poetry night every night, and we're doing XYZ, and this is all happening and it's beautiful. And like, and there's no like, okay, and we need to raise this amount of money to do that. And we need to, you know, there's like not really like a lot of scaffold, which is like totally fine. Like, it should be unrestricted. That's the point of freedom dreaming. And then it's like up to us, you know, as adults to like say, okay, well, what is to fill in the gaps? Like, how do we get there? And, you know, like, that's, I think, like, what's really powerful and really beautiful about, like, you know, like childhood and imagination, you know. And I think that that's something that I really carry with me too. And I think it's sometimes evident in my work. Like, I do have that like imagination. I have that way of like thinking about, you know, like the relationship between the human and the non-human. And I'm trying to like evoke that. I'm trying to rewild that imagination while also holding, you know, like that very like intense grief and that really intense understanding that like we are inheriting a lot of really tough stuff, and we're inheriting like a lot of really tough trauma. And it's not all up to young people to like try and solve it, but they can offer like different perspectives, and they can offer like, you know, like new ways of thinking through crisis that I think is oftentimes underappreciated because because like the mentorship in a lot of ways isn't there. My message to anybody listening is if you know young folks in your community, offer to be a mentor, offer to be a guide. You know, there's so much wealth. I think especially us as folks who do not currently have kids, we can be like such a wealth of support, and like we could be like such like, you know, like a wealth of guidance, even if it is like something as simple as like, I just remember like, you know, growing up, like there was nothing that I could get away with because some auntie up the street would be like, oh, did you know that your daughter was like off over there like 2 blocks past where you said she could go? Like, that's like not really happening as much anymore. You know, even when I was a kid, I hated it, right? Because like, dang, like they got eyes everywhere. But, you know, that's part of community care. And, you know, trying to like, you know, rethink through that and how that can be.
Yeah, I love what you said about the differences in like older folks imagining 5 years in children, because I think that's what I was thinking about. We need that mix of like, I think children, for the most part, if it's not bullied out of them, they're not afraid to think about what doesn't seem possible. And you got to be able, like, we need that, because when a lot of us, including myself, sometimes can't think about what is what doesn't feel possible, then we already put a limit there. We already put a limit there. But when you talk to children, they're really able to poke holes in those limits in our imagination and get us to really expand our thinking. And they really are incredibly insightful. You just got to sit down and listen to them long enough through the TikTok like lore and all that stuff. But even on TikTok, like, I'm sorry, these kids are brilliant. I don't care if I don't understand the slang. I don't care if it sounds silly. Like, they are brilliant and they have access to so much more that, like, I think with the mentorship thing, I think there's this like weird gap because people have such negative views on them. Like, people, and it's like, yeah, I don't know. We were kids once. You knew how we were perceived. Like, we were a part of that getting into social media. Like, we millennials, older mid range millennials really set the stage for where we are with social media. And so it's really weird to this sort of animosity or this way that people look down on Gen Z and whatever that age group is after them, which I'm scared of them and also excited for them because I actually think they have a lot to teach us.
I just want to say that was a really good question, Danny, because I never thought about, like, especially with like young children, what putting an iPad in their hands instead of letting them go outside, or when they don't have access to go outside, right? And the assault that that has on the child's imagination and how it limits how they can envision the future, and it kind of shapes the future for them, and then that kind of limits all of our ability because the children can be part of imagining what our new world can be. But if they are looking at what has been created for them or what people are trying to gear them, yeah, it's just really limiting and impacting them. So my last question that I have about Heirloom is, a common motif in Black literature is flight. It is an idea that I've struggled a lot with, mainly because I feel like, being a Mississippian whose family has stayed here for like almost 200 years, I've been passed down the kind of like burrow gene. But in two poems in particular, I was thinking more about what flight means for Black people. And so in Running, which was a tribute to Ahmaud Arbery, you wrote, "The flight in these legs, a vestigial burden passed down generations of restlessness. We stay moving. It is harder to kill a thing in constant motion." And in Nameless, you wrote, "I think the blackest thing about me are my eyes. Bless how they were taught to keep moving, to seek truth, to always greet the dawn with devotion." And so going back to like migration and movement, is this idea that flight is necessary for Black American survival. Like, it requires us to be hypervigilant, it requires us to move, and it requires a bit of restlessness. So I was wondering about your thoughts on that.
When y'all were kids, did y'all ever read the book The People Who Could Fly? Do y'all know what that one? It's like a picture book. I can't remember who it's by.
I have a copy. I
I
recently
read
bought
it
a
as
few
an
years
adult.
ago.
Yeah. So I read it as a kid and then I read it again as an adult. It's one of those books where I was just like, okay, like I get why it's a children's book, but also like, dang, that's like not like heavy, but like it's like that's a very specific choice to like make that into a children's book. And it comes, like from like, like enslaved narratives, it comes from like folklore and it comes from storytelling. And as somebody who also grew up on like, Uncle Remus tales and like, like Anansi and stuff, like I get it. It kind of like falls within that zeitgeist. And I think a lot of it has been kind of, like sanitized in some ways or like made appropriate for like young kids. And again, I think that is also like a certain level of disconnect too, because in a lot of ways, I think as like Leah maybe had like kind of half mentioned earlier, is that like a lot of like Black youth are forced to grow up. Like they are not regarded as youth. They are not like, like they're denied like childhood in a lot of ways. They're that's the word, they're adultified. But and I think that there's a big difference between like adultification and then also like recognizing like the capacity of young people and being like very candid and being like, like being able to like have like those kind of dialogues with young people. Because I think, like even just thinking about the book, like The People That Could Fly, I think that was very influential. The People That Could Fly, that was always like one of my favorite stories when I was a kid. I was just like, oh my God, I would love to like be able to fly. I would love to be able to like lift off, go somewhere, wherever like wherever I wanted to go, land wherever I wanted to go. Oh my gosh, wouldn't that be amazing? And then, you get older, you read a little bit more of the history, you read like a little bit more of like the density behind that folklore. And it's like, wow, that was like a really real a really real like cosmology and a really real like, like very specific like spiritual tradition where it's like, okay, if you were to leap overboard, your spirit, your soul would fly back to your home in Africa. Or if you were to die, if you were buried face to the east, then like your spirit would like go back to home in the mainland. And that was like through flight. And so I think, a lot about like flight in that kind of like spiritual, like return to the motherland kind of way. And then also just kind of like, as you mentioned, in terms of like migration, constantly moving. I've been like very blessed to like, again, like have like a beautiful home, like in Denver, Colorado. I mean, I live in Oakland now, like, but my mom is like still in Denver, Colorado. My family is still in Detroit, Michigan. And so things feel like very settled. But there is, and like considering history, I think that there is always like this like latent fear about like what comes next. And in a lot of ways, you just want to rest. And in a lot of ways, like Black folks aren't afforded that rest either by, like the government coming in and like claiming eminent domain, or, even thinking about like slave trade, like people having to run away to the north, to the west. Some people decided to just like run away to other parts of the South. Some people decided to maroon, but that still was like a form of running. Whereas like freedom was a place that you kind of like stole away to or you ran towards. And so I think about that a lot, like even when I'm thinking about this ongoing climate crisis and the issues of, like migration and climate refugeeism, a lot of Black folks, like in places like, like Louisiana, I think about like what happened with Katrina, like that is like that those are some of the earliest like internal like climate refugees. And it's not really like considered, folks aren't considered like that. And so, that is like a form of like flight, having to like move because of, like climate disaster or environmental disaster. And I think, like there are, when I go back and I do like some of the retracing, a lot of Black traditions, like prior to us, like becoming detribalized Africans, a lot of us were nomadic. Like we didn't, or like semi-nomadic, like even though we had like houses or we had like, like homestays, places that we stayed, like we moved a lot, we traveled around, we like, like sought different futures. So like, staying fixed, I think is like it's very like specific to certain tribes, but it's also like it's also kind of like very new. And to be able to like have like a home like that is like that's Granny's house that's like passed down, like that is like a very like like a new thing, and but also a very tenuous thing. Like that's not something that's like a constant. I think I would love to find like a stage. I think that in a lot of ways, my work is like writing towards rest and writing towards like, like finding a way to like plant and maintain. But I'm also very much like aware of those realities. And I also think, in terms of like an Afrofuturistic lens, like Space is the Place, Sunrise, like one of my like favorite movies, such a weirdo. But like even like thinking about like the idea of like going to outer space and like finding like a planet where like Black people can thrive and be, it always feels like somewhere away from where we are physically, which is very heavy. And I think that like weighs on your psyche. But it also like, I think that we do a really good job of like blurring the boundary between like the spiritual and the material, where like there is always like there is going to be a place for us to be, and maybe we're gonna have to like fly to get there.
I love that. I adore this collection. There was so much in it, and so much of it overlapped with what we read in Black Earth Wisdom. I'm gonna have to reread it because it was just like, you know how you get to an end of the book and you like, I gotta go back. I gotta go back. But what you said about running just sort of reminded me of my relationship to Mississippi and how I feel like I've been running. But I'm also, there's a part of me where there's something in me that wants to be planted somewhere. I actually don't like always having to move. I like to be just comfortable. Like, as far as like, I like to have a safe place to land. And so constantly having to move, and even this tug of war I have been having with Mississippi, where I feel like my ancestors, when I say it was some spiritual intervention that was keeping me from leaving Mississippi, every time I got my foot over the border, it was like something snatched me back. And then I finally got out, and I don't even know what to make of it. Like sometimes I still, Leah knows, sometimes when we're talking, I'll be like, yeah, I'll still talk about Mississippi as if I'm presently there, where I'll say, yeah, because somehow it's still here as much as I have been running from it. And so, yeah, I think I need to reflect on that more, but it was a thought that came to me about this idea of constantly running, but wanting a place to land, wanting a home, and like, where do we go? Our last question is pulled from Black Earth Wisdom. And it's a question that Leah Penniman asked all of the interviewees at the end of like the sections, the chapters. So we want to know from you, what is the earth saying to you at this moment?
I have a new piece in Art Review Oxford called Genealogy of the Vacant Lot, because I've been thinking a lot about like land use, especially at this time when we're dealing with like widespread, not even just government abandonment, but just like active like government vitriol and like and violence and ramping up, you know, against our communities. And I think the earth is telling me in a lot of ways, like, I want to be in collaboration with you. I want to be like a co-conspirator with you. I want to, if you will let me. I think the earth has so much to teach us and has so much wisdom. The line in the piece that I'm referencing is like, nature is not a dainty miracle, but a violent insurrection. And we love to think about like nature as like just like this beautiful place that's like naturally occurring, but like nature is violent, nature is chaotic, nature is like a trickster. Nature, like uses what she can to live on and to maintain. And I think that the earth is like telling us, like, tap into that a little bit more, like tap into that, like that ancestral rage, tap into, like, let us be like co-conspirators for a new world. Even if the earth is going to remain the same, there is a whole new world waiting for us. And I think like the only way that we can do that is by listening to the earth and listening to her ancestral rage and wisdom, and being like, like collaborators and conspirators with her.
So I just wanted to say thank you again for coming on and for talking with us today. Like Dani said, this was a collection I had read a few months ago, and I was like, Dani, we have to try to get Ashia on to talk about it, because there was so much in here that I just felt like there were things that I have been thinking about for a while, but I felt like you articulated them a lot better than I did. So I'm glad you came. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for your work.
Thank y'all so much, Hoodoo Plant Mamas. I'm really excited to be here. And Leah, I can't wait to read your forthcoming collection. I'm really looking forward to it. And just, appreciate the time and appreciate y'all's questions.
Well, thank you. If you like this episode, you can like, rate, and review Hoodoo Plant Mamas on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. If anything from the show resonated with you, make sure to share it with us on social media. You can find us on Instagram at Hoodoo Plant Mamas. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye.
Bye.